Hello, welcome to BEH 101, Introduction to Behavioral Health. Today we're going to be discussing child welfare services. So the field of child and family services generally involve the care and provision of children who cannot be appropriately cared for by their biological parents, so the children are put in the foster care system. They provide help for those who need support and assistance to provide and manage their families, and may involve family preservation services so the children can be returned to the biological family from a foster care situation. It may also involve the transition from foster care to adoption. Child welfare is an international issue. In 2001, ABC's news show Nightline aired a documentary featuring the horrible plight of the street children of Romania. These children are often resorted to pickpocketing, and other petty crimes are considered by most mainstream Romanians to be the scourge of society, pests to be avoided. The United States' own recent past includes alarmingly similar conditions and attitudes towards orphans, with only 150 to 200 years separating the United States from Romania in this regard. The United States also had several waves of political, economic, and environmental tragedies that resulted in strikingly similar conditions as those experienced in Romania today. Many homeless and orphan children were forced into indentured servitude and apprenticeships which taught them a trade. Two areas of mistreatment of children served as the foundation for child welfare laws. These two areas include, number one, the use of children in the labor market, otherwise known as child labor. And you'll see on the right-hand side a picture from the late 1800s, early 1900s, where you see young children, clearly no older than 9 or 10 years old, working textile machines. And number two, the treatment of children who were, for whatever reason, without parents, most often referred to as orphans or street children. So let's start and go back to colonial America, which for most historical purposes runs from about 1585 to 1763. During this time period, all children were expected to work. Boys were often working in apprenticed positions outside of their homes and away from their families. Girls worked with their mothers and then married in their late teens to start their own families. Apprenticeship involved training young teen boys in a craft, such as blacksmithing or printing. While apprenticeship did not involve overt exploitation, it did focus on children working rather than on the child being educated. It became less popular as industrialization began in the late 18th century or the late 1700s, as machines were developed, replacing the need for many craftsmen. During the many waves of early immigration, individuals, families, and minor children often paid for their passage to the United States through a process called indentured service. The economic system of indentured servitude was extremely exploitive. While indentured servants were not quite considered slaves, their treatment was quite similar. Indentured servitude eventually waned during the 17th century, or the 1600s, in favor of slavery. During the 300 years of the Atlantic slave trade, over 15 million Africans were brought to the United States. African children were either forced into or born into slavery. Infant mortality of African slave children under the age of 4 was double that of white children during the time when slavery was legal. And just to kind of put that in context, we already have high mortality rates in this era, but the mortality rates for African slave children were double, absolutely double that of white children. Slavery was outlawed in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. However, the plight of African children did not improve significantly, and most human service professionals would argue that the legacy of slavery creates significant challenges for African American children to this day. There's a lot of institutional racism, and in a variety of classes you will see this addressed in a variety of ways. By the mid-19th century, the primary form of labor, particularly child labor, was factory work. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of children, some as young as 6, were employed in the textile industry, working 6 days a week, 14 hours a day. Garment industry sweatshops involved what was called outwork, where workers sewed garments and other textiles from their own homes. Women and children were primarily hired for these tasks since they could be paid a lower wage. Post-Civil War era and the Industrial era, which encompasses 1865 to 1900, the Civil War left thousands of children orphaned, plus the poor safety conditions in factories resulted in relatively high number of work-related injuries and death among the poorest members of society, leaving many children orphaned or fatherless. A significant shift in welfare policy for children occurred as a result, with different organizations eager to address the problem of orphaned and abused children. These organizations included settlement houses and workers, as we've discussed with Jane Addams and Hull House, charity organization societies, and government officials. Some orphanages existed in the 1700s, but they did not become the primary means for handling needy and orphan children until the middle to late 1800s. By the 1890s, there was more than 600 orphanages in existence in the United States. Initially, the orphanage system was seen as a significant improvement over placing children in almshouses or poorhouses or forcing them into indentured servitude. As time went on, reports of harsh treatment and abuses were common in orphanages. Then there became the orphan train movement, or the term farming kids out. The origin of this term is rooted in what is called the orphan train movement, a program developed by the first agency to utilize in-home placement, which is similar to modern-day foster care, rather than the institutionalized care or model of having children all live in an orphanage. The New York Children's Aid Society was founded by the Very Reverend Charles Loring Brace, who recognized the serious problem of children growing up on the streets of New York. Brace developed an innovative program where children would be loaded onto trains and taken west to good Christian farming families. Committees who would interview families to ensure that they met the standards for qualified adoptive or foster families. Most children were not legally adopted, but were placed with a family under an indentured contract. Orphan trains ran from 1854 to 1929, delivering approximately 150,000 children to new homes across the West. The early 20th century, the practice of farming out children received increasing criticism, but despite the program's many shortcomings, it is considered the forerunner of the current foster care system in the United States, where children are placed in available private homes rather than in institutions. Jane Addams and her friend Ellen Gates Starr were appalled by the conditions of those living in poverty in urban communities, particularly the plight of recently arrived immigrants who were forced to live in substandard tenement housing and work long hours in factories, often in very dangerous working conditions. This is when Addams became aware of the plight of children forced to work in the factories. Adams and her colleagues began an advocacy campaign against sweatshop conditions in Chicago factories early in the Hull House's existence, advocating in particular for the women and children who were most often hired to work in them. And again, Hull House was a settlement house that Jane Addams created. The Sulzer Bill, which was named for the New York congressman who sponsored the bill, allowed for the creation of the Department of Labor. In 1904, the National Child Labor Committee was formed, and federal legislation called the Fair Labor Standards Act, barring child labor, was finally passed in 1938 and signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Fair Labor Standards Act is a comprehensive bill regulating various aspects of labor in the United States, including child labor, minimum wage, and overtime rules, which are still in existence today and continue to address such issues as equal pay and discriminatory lower wages. So let's look at the child protective foster care system today. Child protection and the care of orphaned and abused children has evolved from institutionalized care or orphanages to primarily substitute family care or foster care over the past 100 years. In 2006, over 500,000 children were in the foster care system. By 2010, that number had decreased to 408,000 children. Almost 100,000, over 100,000 children had fallen from the system. Approximately 41% of all children in foster care are Caucasian, 29% are African American, and 21% are Hispanic. The average age of a foster child is 9 years old. The median length of stay is about 18 months, and the primary goal of the foster care system is to reunite foster care children with their biological parents whenever possible. Federal and state laws have established 3 basic goals for children in the United States child welfare system. 1. Safety from abuse and neglect. 2. Permanency in a stable, loving home. 3. Well-being of the child with regard to their physical and emotional health, and education and developmental needs. So how does a child end up in foster care? When parents cannot or will not protect their children from significant harm, the state has the legal obligation to intervene. The Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974 was established to ensure that children who are mistreated are reported to the appropriate authorities. The Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act of 1980 developed supportive programs and procedures enabling maltreated children to remain in their own homes and to assist family reunification if out-of-home placements were necessary. So who must report child mistreatment? Mandated reporters typically fall into one of several categories and include professionals who work with children as part of their normal work duties. Mandated reporters include personnel in the following fields: medical, education, social service, mental health, law enforcement, child care, and members of the clergy. In most states, the failure to comply with mandated reporting requirements is a crime. Neighbors, friends, or even relatives report suspected child abuse, and those who are not mandated reporters are allowed to call it in anonymously. An investigation is initiated when someone, either a concerned individual or a mandated reporter, places a call to the Child State Abuse Hotline. If the report of an alleged abuse meets the stated criteria, then the report will be accepted and investigated in a timely manner. For state child protective service agencies to receive federal funding, the federal law mandates that all child abuse reports be screened immediately. The actual investigation will vary depending on the specific circumstances of the allegations, but most investigations will involve interviewing the child, the non-offending parent or parents, and the alleged perpetrator. So what is child maltreatment? The federal government has developed a definition of child abuse and neglect and has created 4 general categories of child maltreatment. Number 1, neglect. Number 2, physical abuse. Number 3, sexual abuse. Number 4, emotional abuse. Neglect is failure to provide for a child's basic needs. Neglect may be physical, medical, educational, or emotional. Child abuse is a huge issue in society. In the past 25 years, allegations of child abuse, particularly child sexual abuse, have skyrocketed. Reasons for this include increased public awareness, mandatory reporting requirements, and a significant change in attitudes regarding child abuse, with an increasing sentiment that abuse is no longer a private family matter. The National Institute of Child Health and Human Development developed a forensic interviewing protocol that teaches interviewers how to ask open-ended questions using retrieval cues that rely on free recall. This coordinated approach not only prevents the trauma of duplicative interviews by separate enforcement agencies, but also allows for the highly specialized training of investigators on forensic interviewing techniques that avoid any type of suggestive or leading questions. Many variables influence the outcome of an investigation, including the criteria with which a Child Protective Service agency uses to determine 1, whether abuse is occurring, and 2, whether the abuse rises to the level of warranting intervention. Child abuse investigators are responsible for, number 1, assessing the safety of children who are at risk of maltreatment. Number 2, deciding what types and levels of services may be immediately needed to keep children safe. And number 3, determining under what conditions children must be placed in out-of-home care for their protection. According to the Child Welfare League of America, there are different approaches to making risk assessments of child protection. 2 of the most used include the actuarial or mathematical models of risk assessment and decision making, which assess families based upon factors and characteristics that are statistically associated with the reoccurrence of maltreatment. So basically they're using the probability or the odds of something happening again. The second approach is consensus-based approaches, which are systems where a series of factors are ranked, such as the parents being frequently violent, showing no remorse, being out of control. And where these factors line up will develop where the risk lies, whether it being a high risk or a low risk scenario. When an abuse investigator determines that a child must be placed into protective custody, the child is removed from the home and placed in non-relative foster care or an emergency shelter pending a more permanent placement. Permanency goals for the child must then be determined and can include reunification with the biological parents, living with relatives, guardianship with close friends, short-term or long-term foster care, emancipation with an older adolescent, maybe somebody who's 17, and adoption with termination of parental rights. Shifting permanency plan priorities. So, although reunification with biological parents remains the most common permanency plans, recent changes in many state and federal laws have shifted the focus from protecting the biological family to considering the best interests of the child. And here is a chart from Colorado that looks at these 9 elements when deciding what one should do with the child. So if the child has been living in a scenario where they've been maltreated and the parents have not pursued any remediation to repair their behavior, you have to look at other options. And the other options we have to look at involve these things where, what is the priorities for the child? Maybe the best option is for him or her to live with a relative or friends of the child, live with parents of friends of the child. So there's a lot of issues that may go on there. So let's talk about parental unification. A caseworker works with the biological parents most closely when it is determined that the most appropriate permanency plan is parental reunification. The specific goals must be related to identified parenting deficits, but can also include goals such as counseling, parenting classes, treatment for substance abuse, anger management, securing employment, securing housing, and maintaining regular contact with children. So if a child is removed from a household because one or both parents has a substance abuse problem, in this particular regard, we're then going to be hoping or seeing that the parent goes through treatment so that the child can be reunited with their parent. It is then the responsibility of the caseworker to facilitate the biological parents achieving these goals. Doesn't mean that the parents are not responsible for their behavior. They have to do their part. This might involve giving referrals to the patients or securing services for them, as well as monitoring their ongoing process. As part of any good reunification plan, it will involve a visitation schedule that supports and encourages the child's relationship with the biological parents and provides them with practice with applying new parenting techniques they've learned in parenting classes and counseling. Effective caseworkers will give consistent feedback to the biological parents about their progress toward meeting service plan goals and will balance constructive feedback with encouragement and will protect the parent-child relationship. So why is parental reunification such an important goal? A national survey of approximately 4,000 foster care children aged 2 through 14 who had been removed from their homes due to maltreatment revealed that nearly half of these children had clinically significant psychological and/or behavioral problems. Sue and Hogan, in a study in 1989, identified 5 clinical themes experienced by most children in foster care: separation, loss, grief and mourning, identity issues, continuity of family ties, and a feeling of being in crisis. Children often go through different stages when confronted with significant separation, beginning with pre-protest stage, protest stage, despair, and ultimately the adjustment to the separation. It doesn't mean that they accept the separation, they eventually just adjust to it. The bigger issue is this idea of ambiguous loss, which is defined as loss that is unclear, undefined, and in many instances unresolvable. As adults, we may understand why a child is removed from their home if mom and or dad have a substance abuse problem or a problem with their anger or abuse. But children who love mom and dad and don't understand that abuse is wrong may feel this sense of loss. And this sense of loss is very confusing for the child. And even though the parent is abusive or not supportive, they still feel confused, ambivalent, and guilty to a certain extent. They also feel uncertainty, blocked coping processes, helplessness that leads to anxiety and depression. They respond with absolutes, and they deny. Denial becomes their primary coping mechanism. They're confused about boundaries. They refuse to accept that things won't go back to the way things were, and they don't want to discuss the situation. Additionally, self-identity becomes a big issue, especially as young people enter adolescence. Children tend to be far more external in their self-identity, and their self-appraisal can be quite fragile, varying dramatically if their external structure is removed. So take them away from what they identify as their identification as family, and those things undermine who they feel they are. So factors that are involved in identity formation include one's gender, ethnic, and cultural identity. Children who are removed from their home for maltreatment and are placed in a new environment will struggle with identity issues. Because so much of children's identities reside outside the self and are dependent on external validation and encouragement, effective caseworkers must understand how identity develops and how removing the child from their home can undermine the child's identity development. So if you think about adolescence and you think about how in 7th grade your average 12, 13-year-old might still be a kid, and as they emerge through or evolve through their teen years, they may try different quote-unquote identities. They might try playing sports, they might try being into theater, they might try singing, they might try acting, they might try any number of skills or different activities to find that activity that really connects with them. And that's how they develop their sense of who they are. And part of that is based on where they come from. So if they don't know where they're coming from anymore, they automatically develop this sense of they don't know who they are on the inside, so they can't figure out who they are on the outside. Children who have been removed from their biological homes will undoubtedly lose their sense of continuity with their biological families. Caseworkers consider the importance of continuity and stability when considering where to place a child. Foster care can refer to many placement settings, including kinship care, an emergency shelter, a residential treatment center, a group home, or even an independent living situation. Most frequently, foster care involves placing a child with a licensed foster family. Foster parents provide an invaluable service. Foster placement will be far less likely to fail if the foster parents feel sufficiently well prepared and supported by their caseworker. Because the majority of foster children return to their biological parents, foster parents must be supported in their role in the reunification process. The success of a reunification plan depends largely on the cooperation of the foster parents. Family reunification of foster children with their biological parents is based on many factors, including the biological parents' success in meeting their service plan goals. So if the family reunification is based on the parents completing a drug rehabilitation program and the parents do not complete that program, well, that in and of itself will halt the family reunification. But the timing otherwise is oftentimes based around how to minimize the disruptions in the child's life, such as switching schools in the middle of the school year. An effective caseworker will begin preparing the child for these transitions from the beginning of placement in foster care. Reunification is not just stressful for the child, it is stressful for the biological parents as well, and many biological parents are the most vulnerable to stress-related relapses in the weeks following reunification. Any good reunification plan involves an ongoing monitoring and provision of in-home services. Many international governments are committed to early intervention programs, and many countries report that approximately 80% of families who have participated in family preservation programs remained intact in the year following the suspension of services. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child consists of 41 articles setting forth basic rights of children based upon the best interest of the child principle. The ultimate goal of the UNCRC is to protect the survival, health, education, and development of children, securing their well-being. The international community recognizes the value of the biological family unit and supports all government efforts designed to support families maintain their children. So let's talk about minority populations and multicultural considerations. Types of racial discrimination that one sees in child protective services include racial bias in referring families for family preservation programs versus out-of-home placement. Number 2, racial partiality in assessing parent-child attachment leading to delays in returning children to their biological parents. And number 3, caseworkers who are poorly trained in cultural competencies. So what this basically means is that most people who get into the social work or behavioral health industry or career field are people who are not necessarily your prejudicial discriminatory types, but we all have these unconscious or subconscious biases, or we're just not trained sufficiently to understand the historical aspects of race and bias in our particular society. And as a consequence, there are issues that we still deal with today. So, does race matter in foster care? Controversy exists surrounding the placement of children of color in Caucasian homes. Advocates of placing children of color in homes of the same race cite the cultural dissolution as their argument, meaning that a black child placed with a white family will lose their culture-specific identity. So the idea here is that there are very specific cultural aspects to being African American in the United States that a white family would not understand. And that is absolutely true. The other side of that is, should a black child have to wait for a foster family for an extra week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if there are no African American foster families available? So it's not an easy solution. Alternatives to transracial placement include the development of kinship care programs, meaning someone in the family or someone close to the family become foster parents, where members of the family's child's extended family act as foster parents, often made possible through financial assistance which respect cultural traditions. Now, this is not always possible, but there are alternatives being developed to try and help this. And again, this is a controversial thought process, and it is understandable, but it's also something that there's no easy answers, because if somebody needs love and support and help, it doesn't matter to the child as much as to society who's giving it to them. So let's talk about the Native Americans and the United States child welfare system. And this is an example of why it's important to understand cultural history in the United States. Because not everyone has had positive experiences with the government. The campaign to decimate the Native American population and ultimately force relocation of all Native Americans onto government-designated reservations, where the assimilation into the majority culture became the primary goal of the United States government. It is estimated that from the early 1800s, virtually all Native American children were forcibly removed from their homes on the reservations and placed in Indian boarding schools, taking the children from their homes where they were not allowed to practice their own religion, they were not allowed to speak their own languages, or engage in any of their own cultural practices. So you have a system that, American history kind of glosses over. And this is not to beat up American history at all. This is, in fact, an important part of why, behavioral health specialists and human services people need to understand why there is distrust against the government, because they did this. And, Adolf Hitler wrote about the fact that the United States government did a great job decimating the Native Americans, and that's what he was trying to do with the Jews. I mean, that's a pretty scary thought to think about. Between 1941 and 1978, approximately 70% of all Native American children were removed from their homes and placed either in orphanages or with Caucasian families, many of whom later adopted them. 99% of these children were removed because social workers believed that these children were victims of social deprivation due to extreme poverty. And why were they living in extreme poverty? Because the reservations were basically ghettos for Native Americans. The result of this government action has been nothing short of devastating. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, which prevented the unjustified removal of Native American children from their homes. And, to think about how recent this is what is truly stunning. So we have to keep in mind, again, that as much as we want to do the right thing, we have to remember that there's a historical precedent that we're oftentimes fighting against, because historically we didn't always do the right thing. Gaining a fuller understanding of the history between people of color and the U.S. child welfare system will make it easier to understand why some minority groups may not trust human service professionals regarding allegations of abuse. It is vital that human service professionals develop these cultural competencies, because if you don't know the history, then the history is going to repeat itself. So let's talk about child welfare today. Human service professionals who work with troubled families have the opportunity to effect change that positively affects not only the present families but all future generations within that family system as well. An increased focus on family preservation programs and other early intervention programs offer the best opportunity for reducing out-of-home placements, but these programs must be offered to all potentially appropriate families without bias. And that's why it's important for you to investigate your own sense of bias. So, that's the end of today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or text me or leave a comment. Otherwise, have a terrific day. Thank you.